congratulations to everyone who's presented today and is going to present today. And thanks for everyone viewing right now. For my project, I examined the collections obtained in the Philippines by Edgar Alexander Mearns, who was a collector for the Smithsonian around the turn of the 20th century. I set out to do this because I've been interested in the intersection of science and imperialism for a while. And in my search for materials in this topic, I stumbled upon the extensive and detailed records left by Mearns. When I realized he was collecting in the Philippines right after the Philippine-American War, I figured this would be an interesting case study to unpack. Here I aim to share with you what I learned, namely, what was the context that Mearns was collecting in, what information can we interpret from this, and how can this teach us today, especially today as museum professionals. First, here's some background on Mearns. He was born in 1856, raised in Fort Totten, New York. He was a naturalist by passion and studied to be in medicine. In 1883, he helped form the American Ornithologists Union and was accepted to be a surgeon in the Army Medical Department. At his first assignments, he collected frequently and even pushed out some publications while on duty. And in 1892, he was assigned to the Mexican-US International Boundary Commission, for which he put together a biological survey with the support of the Smithsonian. By 1903, he was a really vital part of the Smithsonian team, despite not having an official position with them. And he did so by corresponding often with the curators and supplying them with new specimens to study. Those curators were pretty enthused when Mearns was assigned to the Philippines. Mearns was an army naturalist, or in other words, an army officer that used his position to collect natural history objects and conduct fieldwork. The Smithsonian actually helped elevate army naturalism to a national trend. Spencer Fullerton Baird, who was the second secretary of the Smithsonian, wrote letters to convince hundreds of officers to collect at their stations and donate to the Smithsonian. This gave the Smithsonian a huge boost in collections as it took advantage of the United States' westward expansion. For example, at Mearns' first assignment in Fort Verde, Arizona, his main duty was to keep the recently relocated Apache community in check. The territory was still relatively unexplored and thus a prolific area of study as well, though. This use of imperialism as a vehicle for natural history would follow as the US expanded overseas. The Philippines at this time, there we go. The Philippines at this time had just exited 300 years of colonization from Spain. And much of the fuel for this desire for Philippine independence came from a desire for autonomous education and science, which was withheld during Spain's rule. When the United States took the colonial reins, they portrayed themselves as more progressive and scientifically minded. They did build up several scientific institutions in their rule, but mainly conducted medical research to benefit transplanted American bodies. The growing importance of medicine led to heightened demand for army surgeons, and in that wave to satisfy that demand came Mearns. Mearns' time in the Philippines can be divided into two periods. His first tour lasted from July 1903 to September 1904, followed by a break where he returned to the US after falling ill. And then his second tour was from December 1905 to April 1907. Mearns' first tour took place in the Philippine South, and this is interesting because this region was never fully colonized by the Spanish, thanks to the vigorous resistance of the local Moro or Muslim community. So while the United States implemented civil authority in most of the Philippines, Moro South was subjected to a military government and continued warfare long after the formal end of the Philippine-American War. The first military governor of the Moro province, Leonard Wood, was appointed right around the time that Mearns arrived. Wood initiated several punitive campaigns against Moro leaders, and many of those campaigns Mearns served on. but Wood was also a science enthusiast and encouraged Mearns to collect in their downtime. Mearns' journals reveal a schedule packed with fighting, medical duties, and collecting. He wrote mainly of the militaristic campaigns, but still thoroughly detailed his collections. If we take a look at this map that I made, we see where Mearns most frequently collected, and we see that it's almost entirely concentrated in this Morrow-land region. And actually, rather impressively, it spans most of the entire region. But I'll talk a bit more about this map again in a few slides. His second tour, in contrast, was mostly removed from warfare. This time he led several biological and geographical reconnaissance trips, as they were approved by the War Department and Philippine authorities, thanks largely to the relationship that he developed with Leonard Wood. He received more support to conduct his work in the form of supplies and people, including Philippine-based American scientists, and now being able to exercise more freedom in where he collected, he traveled to areas in the central and northern portions of the Philippines, in addition to the south. You can see that reflected in this map, which again shows you the same thing, where he was collecting in this second trip that he took. By the time Mearns left the Philippines for good, he had amassed over 5,000 objects. And to get a better sense of what that means and what it meant back then, let's take a look at this chart. Before Mearns arrived in the Philippines, the Smithsonian only had around 5,000 objects to begin with. By 1908, that number quadrupled, and a third of that growth is due to Mearns alone. His contribution still accounts for about 2% of NMNH's Philippine objects. And even now, he ranks 8th in the list of individuals who contributed the most objects from the Philippines throughout the entire Smithsonian. And these figures don't even include the boxes upon boxes of records which are associated with the objects. But since his objects are now mostly split up between the various departments in NMNH, a lot of that continuous historical context is broken up or invisible. To illustrate that point more, I want to talk about a couple of examples. First, I want to address his anthropological contributions, which were not included in the previous figures, the previous maps, because there's no precise localities associated with these. But throughout both his excursions, Mearns still collected just shy of 300 objects that are anthropological in nature. And while there is a broad span of cultures represented by these collections, thanks largely because of his second series of tours, which saw him go across the archipelago, most of the objects are still Morrow items from Mearns' first tour. Many of these objects do not have much direct documentation about their origin, aside from the fact that they had come from Mearns at this time. However, coupled with Mearns' notes, you find passages suggesting that these objects were either gifted by cooperative Morrows or else looted from destroyed villages after battle. Regardless, these are items of conflict, but you would not know without supplementary information from the division of birds or the division of mammals, etc. Secondly, now's the time I want to return to this map. Mearns' objects and notes survive as some of the most comprehensive records of the Morrow rebellions. This is a severely understudied event in American history, and so Mearns' journals hold a lot of value. His records have very specific names of places, people, and occurrences that are scarcely found in other documents. And so when we look at this map, it's not just a tracker of biological specimens, it also tracks a long forgotten military conflict. My plan is actually to incorporate a temporal axis in this map to show the movement of those military campaigns. But to summarize the key takeaways from those examples, on a high level, we see here that natural history collections themselves can contain or reflect global trends, especially in regards to expansion. And because of that, cataloging is important, which is something I want to reiterate that was highlighted excellently by Daisy, Karen, and Jade. In this case, keywording and key phrasing is very important. The Philippine-American War and War rebellions were pretty defining moments in the emergence of modern America, yet neither of these are common key phrases. At best, you're gonna see the Philippine insurrection associated with an object from that time period, or the Spanish-American War will be used in place. But of course, those aren't terms that you will see associated with objects at NMNH usually. So the last point I want to touch on is the fact that I've been inspired greatly by the efforts of NMAH, the American History Museum, to reinterpret their rhetoric and highlight more marginalized stories. But I'm hoping that the information presented here makes it evident that all museums have these hidden histories that could be tremendously valuable to the public. I want to end by reiterating this question that guided me throughout my research. What can this teach us? What can we learn from this these expeditions that happened well over 100 years ago? And just to give more background on Mearns, once this whole thing was done, after he left the Philippines, he had such an impressive reputation that he was recruited to join Theodore Roosevelt on the Smithsonian Roosevelt expedition in Africa. There he had the most prolific results of his career. And however, at the same time, war continued in the Philippines, and the US exerted a scientific dominance that many countries still depend on today. I'll soon have a complete paper addressing more in depth how Mearns represents the use of science as a resource that is science and knowledge as a resource that can be extracted through colonialism. But I'm very glad that today everyone here has I guess if you've been around for the past presentations, you have like you've been presented with lots of really interesting information about how we're being conscious of our positionality today. And I, again, want to encourage people to stay conscious, be never ignorant of the power that we hold just by the fact that we do research here. And yeah, I'm just very fortunate to be included in this whole cohort of people who seem to be also invested in similar interests. And yeah, I'm very grateful for that. So thank you. Thank you to Eileen and Chris, of course. Thank you to Theo Gonzalez, my advisor. Everyone at NMAH and the Smithsonian Institution, especially the people who have made this whole transition to working from home easier. And thank you to the whole I2F family.